Hey, 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 what's up? What's up, my sociology family? It's the old man, because I haven't shaven, cleaned up my beard. It's the old man, Professor J. Um, Here to give you your virtual lecture for this week. I'm really sad that I can't be in the classroom with you guys. This is totally my last day being away. This is the last little sniffles going away, and I'll be back in class on Monday. But I want to have this lecture on the sociology of health. This is the topic that we're discussing this week, and I would be lying if I didn't say I was equally excited as much as I am intimidated by this subject. Excited and intimidated a little bit because there's so many directions that this conversation about the sociology of health can go. There's so many aspects to it, and I just really want you guys to slow down and read this chapter and really, just spend a moment with this material, particularly because there are also so many of you guys that are nursing students. We know that our area is a huge area for healthcare with our Vidant Medical Center and our Vidant Health Systems. And so many of you all have nursing and medicine as a part of your intended major. So this is super important. Also, I know that when we think about health and medicine, usually we think in terms of biology, psychology, chemistry, right? Medicine, things of that nature. But we don't often think about health and medicine in terms of sociology. But sociology really does account for a huge amount of perspective and insight into health and wellness. And I think it would benefit us greatly to think about the social construct of illness and medicine or health and wellness, right? And to be able to see this as a social construct, meaning all of this is not just pure fact. A lot of it is about the realities that we construct through through the way that our social organizations interact, and then the way that we as humans and civilians interact in society. And a lot of that creates the sociology of health and wellness, illness, and medicine, right? First, we should think about just the sick role, right? What happens when a person is sick? Look, I'm away holding virtual classroom sessions because I'm classified as sick. Um, so think about when a person takes on the sick role or is granted, right? Because it is something that needs to be granted by society. That when a person is granted the sick role, that is a sanction that allows them medical deviance, right? It's a sanction that allows them to deviate from their normal obligations to society, their obligations to many aspects of social life, and it allows them to be considered medically deviant for a specific amount of time. For me, it's kind of okay that I moved class to virtual sessions for a week. But hey, if this were to stretch 3 weeks, right, that deviance would not be allowed, and folks would then begin to question my status or my abilities to teach, right? So so when we think about that, right, and then not only just the sick role, right, we have to think about other allowances that come along with the sick role. It's how are you going to be? It allows you to withdraw from society. And like for me, I'm able to withdraw. I've been home for the past 3 days, working on my third day now. I'll probably have to come out tonight and get back to normal things because it's starting to stretch too long, and I have some obligations that I can't push off. Um, Plus, I've been tested for COVID, and I know that I'm negative, and I'm only down to a light sniffle now. So I think I'm ready to get back to society. But but also let's think about how my screen is moving a little bit. Excuse me, guys. So to think about how the sick role allows us to then receive medical treatment, right, as prescribed by professionals. It allows us to receive drugs that sometimes we may not otherwise be allowed to have or take, and even receive monetary compensation. Right, we can apply for a level of disability that allows us to receive a large array of allowances and even monetary compensation that will allow us to pay our bills and to be able to feed ourselves and our families, even though we are not able to participate in social life and greater social functions, right? That would allow us to earn money. So you can apply for and receive disability within our society, and that will allow you to even receive monetary compensation so that you can still feed your families even though you wouldn't be able to work. And all of this is a total social construct. These are not medical facts. They like to be based on medical facts, but they're not just facts, right? And when I talk about how these like to be based on medical facts, this leads us to another term that is super important in the idea of the sociology of health, and that is the process of medicalization, right? When I say that we like for these social constructs to be based on medical facts, well, in order for something to become a medical fact, there's a process of medicalization that has to take place, right? And this refers to, and I'm going to read a little bit, make sure my notes are here. Medicalization refers to the process by which previously normal aspects of life are redefined as medically deviant, right? And requiring of medical attention. So it's a situation where something was being considered as a normal aspect of life, but then through a process of doctors and physicians and even oftentimes the courts and governments come together and all of a sudden develop a label that allows for something that was once normal in society to be deemed as medically deviant. And now if a person receives this label, they can then begin to be eligible for medical treatments and and other kinds of responses, right? Medical attention in order to remedy this issue. And this is important because it determines who responds, how they respond, and how we view the responsibilities of the person or patient. Because if you don't have that label, right, then you don't get a medical response. You might get a response from another agency, right? You might get a response from the law, from the police department, right? If and we'll get into some examples of that, right? We can think about the idea of PTSD, where civilians were returning home into civilian life from out of the military, and although the definition of PTSD has been broadened to populations outside of the military, but I think the population that made this term most popular and socially acceptable and pushed this term through its process of medicalization was our military soldiers. So many of our soldiers were returning home to civilian life and were experiencing all kinds of complications with reassimilating into normal civilian life, and those complications were leading to larger social problems. Many of these actually were having all sorts of breakdowns and I'll say traumatic fits, what we may have called them previously, that would have warranted a police response. There were incidents of violence, domestic violence, violence in the home, violence in communities that prior to the medicalization of the PTSD term, these incidents, these traumatic fits would have been responded to with law enforcement, with police, right? So through the medicalization process and us beginning to understand what PTSD is, we developed a medical response for this and developed treatments for these individuals in order to, if not remedy, at least be able to cope with this thing that is now considered a medical sickness, right? Even terms like obesity have been medicalized. They've gone through a process of medicalization, whereas at once we didn't understand obesity the way we understand it now. Even another example would be addiction, alcohol addiction, and drug addiction. Right? If we think about it, drug addicts used to be sentenced to time in prison, and a lot of time in prison, oftentimes, especially when it comes to low income populations, minority populations. But so many of us, so you might hear, and you guys are kind of young, but you may be old enough to either know about or have at least heard conversations about the war on drugs in the 80s and 90s, and how people were being arrested and sentenced to tons of years in prison, primarily black people, right? Which led to this issue of mass incarceration in American society. A lot of that was driven by the war on drugs, to where low income black and brown communities, communities of color, were being ravaged by the drug epidemic. And then our the response to that drug epidemic, remember, the social response to that drug epidemic was something that was driven 100% by police force. So police force came into these communities with battering rams and all sorts of SWAT gear and tactical gear and all this military tactical training, and they went into these communities to combat the drug epidemic with law enforcement tactics, with military tactics, right, that were brought into our communities of color, and which led to this issue of mass incarceration, where just large swaths of the black and brown populations are still serving years on top of years in prison due to their involvement in the drug epidemic, right? But as time progressed, the drug epidemic turned into the opioid crisis. The war on drugs turned into the opioid crisis. Now, if we just think about the terminology of that, that terminology speaks heavily to medicalization, right? Because if we're calling it a war on drugs, let's just think about the language that we're using, and obviously this is a little bit of symbolic interactionism here, right? But if we think about the language that we're using when we term something the war on drugs, we're signaling to our community that this is something that we're going to be involved in with a hard-nosed fight. We're going to be tough on crime. We're going to be tough on drug dealers and drug addicts, and we're going to make sure that we kind of hit them with the hard and long arm of the law, right? But then as this war on drugs started to kind of spill over into our white communities, then the terminology began to change, because it began to affect more people that were considered a part of mainstream society. It began to affect more of our professionals, more of our members of our affluent communities, and then all of a sudden the language began to change, and the war on drugs became the opioid crisis, and it became something that we needed to respond to with compassion and medical treatment and programs and things of that nature. And now our society is beginning to shift because of the medicalization of drug addiction. The same thing goes on with alcohol addiction, and then obviously with crime itself, right? We're just starting to, we haven't turned the corner on this, but we're just starting to learn as a society that many of the things, much like PTSD, many of the things that we are responding to with law enforcement officers are actually mental health disorders that we need to respond to with medical professionalism, and make sure that these members of our communities receive the proper treatments, rather than just punishment and sentences to jail or prison time, right? Just to have them return back to our societies untreated and go through this cycle of these fits, and then a response with police arrest and incarceration, back on the streets, going through this cycle over and over again without these issues being treated, right? In order for them to be treated, it has to be medicalized first. So when we think about the fact that in order for something to be treated, it has to be medicalized, then let's think about, right, other mental health disorders, anxiety disorders, mood disorders, personality disorders, things that we are still struggling to understand in society, that if you're struggling with it, you would, at this current time, you are still expected to attend class. You're still expected to attend work. You are still expected to function normally in society until this process is properly medicalized. And even if the processes are there for you to medicalize it, think about this: if you don't have a relationship with your primary care physician, or you don't have health insurance, or if you don't have the dollars to be able to go through the process of medicalization, then you will not become a card carrying member of this label of medical deviance that would say, hey, I am suffering from this, that, or the third, and I require a different kind of response from my professors, from my university, from my job, from my society, from my friends, peers, or whatever, right? You have to have something for that. But what's the process like to get it? And is that process available to everyone? So how many people are there suffering from conditions that are going untreated and not getting the proper response from, you know, society? And if the difference between those who do get the proper response and those who don't comes down to money and resources, then the medicalization process and also health and wellness is something that has to be considered a commodity in our society. If everyone does not have equal access, then what we've done is we've commodified health and wellness so that everyone doesn't have access to it. And these are all major concepts that are looked at through the lens of sociology. And I think another thing that sociology looks at is the stigma associated with these things, right? With medical deviance, right? Or things that are haven't been medicalized yet but are still observed in society with a level of misinformation, miseducation, and then negative stigma, right? I think obesity is considered by many as still the most stigmatized condition that we have. It's almost it's what's what many call, I think the book calls it, the last allowable discrimination. It's that all the numbers reflect that members of our communities that suffer from obesity or struggle with obesity, they miss out on professional opportunities for professional advancement. I don't think we have ever had an obese president. Um, or if we have, one of the things that we talk about in politics a lot is the electability of someone. It's the likability of a political candidate, and normally that person needs to be slender, needs to have a good appearance, right? And if a person is obese, they would be considered not as viable a candidate as someone that looked the part, right? Obesity is discriminated against in so many ways. But again, this goes back to the stigmatization of these things. Although we are trying to learn and grow in our understanding about mental health disorders, there's still a stigma. We call it crazy. And that stigma makes a lot of people who might even have access to the resources not want to seek help because they don't want to become a card carrying member of this particular population of medical deviants. And when I say medical deviants, again, I'm not talking about a negative term of deviance. I'm talking about deviance that allows us to have the social sanction to deviate from our normal social requirements. You've got to have some kind of classification, some kind of diagnosis in order to receive this social sanction of medical deviance. Um, and a lot of this begs the question for sociologists: do the doctors, a few questions. One question is, do our doctors have too much power in regulating who is considered sick and who is not sick? Um, or What about the person who is sick but refuses to leave their role, right? There's a lot of talk about our presidents oftentimes being well up in age. There was a lot of discussion about Donald Trump being close to the age of 80, and this idea of mental capacity that is lost in many cases as we reach those ages around 80. Joe Biden is up there, and we are questioning his mental stability or his mental capacity, if you will. There's a better term for it. And when we look at it, we were talking about Donald Trump's age, but at that time, no, not Donald Trump. A lot of us were talking about Bernie Sanders' age during the last presidential election because he was at that age, around that age of 80. But while we were talking about Bernie Sanders, although Donald Trump was getting the skin treatments and other things, and Hillary Clinton was being dressed up and make up, right? There was really very little difference in all of their ages. It was just that Bernie Sanders wasn't going through all of the steps to redo his appearance, right? He was now. I think he was going through some makeup processes, but maybe not as much of an effort as those other candidates. So we were questioning his, but we were not questioning the others. And we have had a history, especially our most recent history, of a lot of very elderly candidates that are signing up to, if you're signing up at 80, and many of our presidential candidates serve 2 terms because it's easy to be elected for a second term. That means if you come into office at 80, you'll be exiting at 88, right? And a lot of people question that, and I'm only lifting that idea up just to have us think about what happens when people go into this space of, I guess this can be attributed to demedicalization, right? Where something that should be considered or would be considered a medical situation is all of a sudden demedicalized, or it hasn't been medicalized at all, right? It's a process where maybe we should be looking at something and assigning some medical response to it, but this person continues to hold a position. We have a current city council member, whose name I will not mention, but she is well up in age, has had a ton of bouts, with health and wellness, misses a lot of council meetings, and is oftentimes found on council to be, I'll dare say, while she maintains one of the most respected seats on city council, most of us revere her as the mama of the council. She's the one that kind of anchors, she's considered the one that kind of anchors the council in a spirit of love and compassion, right? Because of the age that she brings to council. But oftentimes, she's also the one that where things has to be explained to 3 and 4 times, and oftentimes when she's speaking on an issue, she's found to be totally off subject, or found to be maybe not getting the main idea or the main concepts that are being discussed. And in these very awkward incidents, the society or the community around her, the other elected officials, the other members of staff that might be there presenting on certain topics that are up for discussion and up for vote, or the community members that are there to participate in the civic process, when those incidents happen, when she is found kind of off the mark, everyone just kind of sits there. Everyone knows what's going on, but no one could ever bring it up out of respect, right? But what happens when this person continues to serve month after month, year after year, and they continue to be electable because no one wants to disrespect one of our aged advisors? But again, this speaks to the process of socialization and medicalization. It's what happens when that person refuses to accept medical deviance and no longer, and just leave their post. Or another question: is the system too slow to respond to the medical demands of our society, and what populations are thereby relegated to suffer untreated while the system develops its response, or while the system decides if it's going to respond or not, right? So these are a lot of questions. Excuse me, y'all. These are a lot of questions that are asked, and I dare say answered, but I'll stop short of saying answered and say at least asked and explored through the lens of sociology. And there's so much to it, guys, and I really hope you read this chapter carefully, and we'll have a much deeper discussion on Monday. The last thing I want to lift up is obviously health by race and ethnicity. When we look at populations and access to the commodity of health care, health and wellness, right? And obviously we have socioeconomic disparities that tend to exist along racial lines within our nation, so that black and brown communities, communities of color, tend to have lesser access to resources than our white counterparts in America. So, how does this play out in the terms of health and wellness? Statistically speaking, communities of color statistically have a significantly lower life expectancy, and 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 a much higher infant mortality. I'll say a significantly lower life expectancy and a significantly higher infant mortality than our white counterparts. And there are studies that have shown that this gap had begun to narrow. Now get this. This gap had begun to narrow during the civil rights movement of the 60s. But then the gap went back to widening as we got into the 80s. Now, we all know that the drug epidemic is something that kicked up in the 80s. The war on drugs kicked up in the 80s and 90s and on into mass incarceration, right? So now we all know that within sociology, correlation does not mean causation, right? So we can't, by that fact, say that the drug epidemic and the war on drugs caused the gains that we were making within these communities to be lost, and then the gap in disparities started to widen again. But we can certainly say that there's some correlation between those timelines. But it's very interesting that during the civil rights era, those gaps were starting to narrow. But then as we got into the 80s, they started to widen again and have, still been widening. Um, so we definitely want to look at those disparities within our nation that exist not only along race and ethnicity, but also along gender, right? Here's another interesting fact with gender. Psychologists have noted that 75% of all diagnoses of borderline personality disorder are for women. I'll repeat that. 75% of all diagnoses of borderline personality disorder are for women. Now, that is suggesting that this diagnosis is being used as a catch-all diagnosis for way too many women, rather than doing the hard work to dig and diagnose issues at a much more accurate level, right? Because we know the diagnosis determines the intervention within the health community, right? So if we misdiagnose something, or if we're too lazy in diagnosing something, or if we don't give people the proper attention, the proper respect to really spend the time with them and honor their issues, to really figure out what's going on, and if we're lazy in our diagnosis, then we find a lot of people being misdiagnosed and thereby mistreated, right? Or maltreated, even, I think is a better word. So there are disparities along race, ethnicity, and gender, and so many other things, right? We know that there are issues within the LGBTQ community with spouses being able to, it was a big deal and a big much to do about spouses that are in non-gender conforming relationships being able to benefit from their spouse's health care and things of that nature. So that was a big issue. Also, you guys should understand health insurance. You should know the difference between socialized medicine and universal health care. There's a lot of debate. Our society is always debating that, and the idea of socialized medicine gained a negative connotation, really dating back to the Cold War. This idea of socialist governments and things of that nature, right, still carries a negative connotation. Um, but just understand the difference, and we may have an opportunity to talk more deeply about this. But understand that socialized medicine is a form of medicine to where the physicians, the practitioners are all government employees. They're paid for by government. Everyone has access to it, but the entire medicalization process, the entire healthcare system becomes a government system. It becomes government run. A lot of people would argue many different ways, up and down, about that topic, but just know what it is. Know that socialized medicine is where the health system becomes a government system. And this is very different than universal health care. Universal health care is not a system to where it becomes government run. Universal health care is a system that requires that health insurance be offered to all citizens universally, no matter what. Everybody, it determines that everybody should have access to health care, but it's not a government run system. And that's going to be your primary difference. Universal health care, I think the book even says the nation that we look to the most for their model of universal health care would be Canada. But definitely know the difference between the two. You will be asked that, and even more importantly, we want we want people to be a part of our society that are well informed, especially when it comes to important topics that are oftentimes debated and even smeared through the media. One of the reasons it can be smeared is because terminology is used that can trigger people, especially when people don't truly understand the meaning and definitions behind these terms. So these are two terms that are used often in the debate for healthcare. And we want you guys to understand those so you can be valuable, so you can contribute in a valuable way in your communities and society about this discussion. And then I also want you guys to understand the big one. The biggest one of all is the social determinants of health. Now, I'm not going to go deep into that because my plan is to discuss the social determinants of health in person with you all on Monday. But just understand that the social determinants of health is this phenomena that really bridges the gap between sociology and the medical field, because it's a scenario where our professionals within the healthcare professions started to make the departure from solely looking at health and wellness through a clinical lens, and instead beginning to look at it through a societal lens, right? And always remember that this is important because diagnosis determines the intervention. So if all of this money and resources have been placed within our healthcare systems, but all of that money is being spent through clinical treatments, and meaning it's taken all of society's illnesses and tried to bring it to be treated within a clinical setting. And that's happened for decades. I might argue even a century or so, maybe even more, right? That we've been trying to fit all of society's medical illnesses into treatments within the clinical setting. But through this understanding of this development of the concept of the social determinants of health, what we've been able to do is work with our medical systems, our healthcare systems, to kind of loosen up their approach to go much more broad than just the clinical setting and begin to look at communities. and look at the different situations and circumstances that are prevailing in our communities and understand that most of the illnesses that you are trying to treat in the clinical setting are actually happening because of drivers that are taking place in the communal setting. Meaning the things that are driving diabetes, obesity, hypertension, all these other things, right? The drivers for those disparities are taking place in these communities, in the neighborhoods. So it's almost a situation that says, imagine if we took all these resources, all these healthcare resources that were being kind of relegated to the clinical setting and begin to move them into communities and to actually start to drive community level interventions, neighborhood level interventions to help address some of these disparities before they end up in the emergency room, right? So hopefully we'll have a very rich discussion about this on Monday. But I really wanted to just take this session to open up you guys' mind to the idea of the sociology of health and understand how important it is. And I really hope you guys take a moment to read this chapter carefully. And I look forward to having a very meaty discussion on Monday with you all. We'll see you soon. Oh, I will have some questions to attach to this video. So make sure that you not only watch this video, but go back and answer the questions. That is how you will show your attendance and your participation. Two things: attendance and participation. So, yep. I look forward to being back with you guys on Monday, and thanks so much for your flexibility with me during this time.